Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, we explore Fyodor Dostoevsky's most famous work, Crime and Punishment. Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is probably the most famous work of 19th century Russian literature. Written in a time of intellectual, socio-political, and moral upheaval in the Russian Empire, Dostoevsky's work must be understood in the context of the debates of Russian nihilism and egoism. So here it is important, before we begin, to understand what Russian nihilism and egoism in philosophy are. Russian nihilism and egoism are not about the absence of value and the meaninglessness of life and the self-centered deceit of the individual, as is often portrayed and promoted on social media and the print media. On the contrary, nihilism and egoism are about the individual's so-called heroic struggle to destroy the existing order of moral, political, religious, and social oppression and usher in a supposedly better, freer, more equal world that all individuals can build. Nihilism is not the absence of value or the meaninglessness of life. Nihilism, in its proper philosophical context, is about the destruction of an existing order from which the heroic actions of the individual, the ego, can build a new order, new values, and new virtues to replace it. Nihilism and egoism go together. They entail destruction, and out of destruction, rebuilding. And that is who Raskolnikov is. He is the nihilistic ego, ready to embark on the so-called heroic struggle of nihilism. As we know, he ultimately fails. After murdering the pawnbroker and her daughter, Raskolnikov sinks into despair. His crime has brought internal, psychological punishment. Dostoevsky's character development of Raskolnikov asserts that man is too weak to achieve what the nihilist philosophers claim. Moreover, far from creating a new morality that will achieve liberation and new virtue, they destroy all morality in their assault on the moral order. Raskolnikov suffers as a result of his crime. That is because for Dostoevsky, there is a transcendent moral order, and man, as a rational agent, knows that moral order, and he will suffer when he commits grievances and crimes against it. Suffering is the great theme of Dostoevsky's work. It is also implied rather explicitly by the title, Crime and Punishment. Punishment is the suffering, but there is also suffering in committing crime, as we see with Raskolnikov. Suffering is part and parcel of the world. We cannot escape it. The lies of nihilism and the deceit of Raskolnikov was his belief that he could create a perfect, better, new world, a new morality that would reduce the suffering of many. This, of course, is what he wrote about in his famous newspaper article that the policeman brings up during the interrogation scenes. And this, of course, is also the argument, the intellectual argument that Raskolnikov was having with himself when deciding to commit his crime. We cannot escape suffering, but we can be redeemed by it. Many of the characters we meet all suffer in some way, shape, or form. But the redemptive and heroic suffering that brings about salvation is of a woman. Enter Sonia. Sonia is the heroine of suffering. She suffers greatly throughout the work, and even suffers to be with Raskolnikov, despite his crimes. Her suffering is an in situ manifestation of the suffering of Christ. She is holy wisdom incarnate. Pleading for Raskolnikov to embrace God near the end of the novel, he reaches for the New Testament, the Book of Life. Sonia's suffering eases Raskolnikov's suffering, and there is wonderful symbolism in their dialogue with each other as Sonia pleads and pleads and pleads that Raskolnikov embrace the reality of God, accept his suffering as the path to redemption. Raskolnikov confesses his crime, and he does hard labor in Siberia, something that Dostoevsky knew firsthand, for he was forced to do hard labor in Siberia. There is, in some scholarship, the assertion that elements of Raskolnikov reveal Dostoevsky's own life. Dostoevsky was a reader of Russian nihilist and egoist philosophy. He had read German philosophy. He may have been intoxicated with the same ideas that Raskolnikov embraces to commit his crime. And of course, Dostoevsky ended up in Siberia doing hard labor, just as Raskolnikov does. Sonia, however, never abandons him, despite all the suffering and the hardship that they go through together. She suffers with him, waiting for his freedom. And when he is freed, the two eventually marry in love. Dostoevsky shows in Crime and Punishment that suffering, punishment, is inescapable. How we handle it, however, offers us a path to redemption. Redemption runs through suffering love, not the heroic illusion of the revolutionaries, the nihilists, and the egoists, who only bring more suffering, misery, death, and destruction, and barbarism in their wake. This suffering, misery, and barbarism is masked as progress and utopia. Dostoevsky tells us that it's all a lie. Furthermore, Dostoevsky is also telling us that suffering together is better than suffering alone. When you suffer alone, you will ultimately succumb to death and destruction. Think of certain characters within Crime and Punishment to whom that actually happens to. However, if you suffer together in love, because love binds two or more together as one, this brings new meaning and new life into the world. And that is ultimately what is revealed in the suffering love that brings Raskolnikov and Sonia together. Sonia, if you recall, at the end of the novel, never abandons him, despite the suffering that Raskolnikov is in, despite the punishment that he must do in Siberia. And thus, as they suffer together in love, they win their freedom together. And in that freedom, they marry and have new life.